Okay, I have the final section of visual attention to address before we get to move on, and I think that I can finish it in the next 20 minutes or so, which is about what we have left. And I'm going to start by talking about distraction and our task, the characteristics of the task that we're really trying to do when we are doing this kind of multitasking, or when we are trying to focus our attention on a specific task, but then other things are distracting us. So I want you to think of times when you have experienced task irrelevant stimuli in your environment. And this is a time when students share things with me. And again, I'm just sharing what other students have said previously. And if people want what happens with me, it's those billboards on the highway that change over time, that have that apparent motion. I find them very distracting, and for me, they're a little bit dangerous. I do have ADHD, so I feel like those need to be just gone. But different students have shared with me. Usually what I hear is things like, I'm in a classroom and people in front of me are doing something that is visually distracting for me to pay attention to what's happening at the very front of the room, which is the professor. I'm trying to work on my homework, and there's other noise wherever I am, whether it is, my neighbor's making a lot of noise, or my brother's making a lot of noise, or whatever kind of noise is happening in my environment when I'm trying to focus on a specific task. Trying to think of other things students have said. But you can come up with your own. I mean, that's the point of this, is for you to think about times when you have experienced task irrelevant stimuli in your environment. I'm going to come back to this slide that just reminds you the difference between selective attention, when I'm really focusing on specific aspects of my environment and ignoring others so that I can perform a particular task. And we talk about this as attention as the director, versus divided attention, when I'm really trying to pay attention to several things at once. We now call this multitasking, as if this is something we're supposed to be able to do, but now we really are talking about our attention as the scheduler, and we are not multitasking in the way that we think we are multitasking. We are going back and forth between tasks where we have to pay some attention to one task or the other, and so the other task, whatever we're not paying attention to at that time, is getting missed at that time. And even if one of those tasks is really quite automatic, the little bit of attention that goes to that automatic task is taking some attention away from whatever other task we might want to be paying attention to. I sometimes refer to this as divided attention is when good characters die. So when I was playing Dungeons and Dragons with my nephew and niece, he was the dungeon master, and my niece and I were all playing on the phone most of the time, over the phone, and we played these characters for maybe 3 or 4 years. He maybe put us in a situation that was a little bit dangerous, but if we had been paying attention, I don't think our characters would have died. But I was playing solitaire at the time, which again is not a task that takes great attention. It's pretty automatic. I don't know what she was doing, but my niece is severely ADHD, so whatever else she was doing, and she's always trying to do 2 things at once just to keep her brain active. That prefrontal cortex needs to be active. But she missed whatever. She completely missed when she kind of missed when she died, quite honestly. One of the people who has looked into this question quite a bit is Nili Lavi. So, and she has found that really it's the nature of the task you are doing that tells us what kind of distraction is possible. So what is the effect of the unattended stimulus or the distraction? And what I show over on the right is the possible distraction, which I think was used in many of her studies, where SpongeBob or some animated character or something came up somewhere on the screen, In this case, it's the top, but it came up somewhere on the screen. And on the left-hand side, you can see that, so if you're saying whether or not there is an X, sometimes it was the question, is there an X or an N? And you had to press the left or the right, but I'm just going to stick with, is there an X? And you're finding the X. Well, on the top screen, or the top picture there, it's very easy because the O's are really different from an X, and they're all the same as each other, and so the X kind of pops out. We saw this with the single feature search, but that really doesn't take a lot of attention. That's the task. So we're then going to compare that to the bottom picture on the left, where if I'm saying, is there an X, yes or no, it's going to take me a little bit longer because there are other letters that share characteristics with the X, and so I'm kind of having to put together those features and to concentrate more and look at those characters more to say, yes, there is an X. I just realized this is another one of those pictures in the book that they didn't give me for my slides, and it's a little bit annoying, but if you go to page 142, figure 628, what it basically shows is that if I have no distractions, that finding the X among O's is very easy. I mean, it is clearly the easy task. And finding the X among all these other letters that share features with the X is harder, and it takes about 200 milliseconds longer. If we then go over and look at what happens when we're distracted, when it's hard and I'm finding the X among letters that are similar, there's a little bit of a slowdown when that distraction, that SpongeBob or whatever, comes up on the screen. But when it's easy, and all I had to do was find the X among O's, and so there was this really automatic task, when that animated picture comes up on the screen, there's a more significant slowdown in that condition than when it's more difficult. And so Forster and Labbe in 2008 came up with the load theory of attention, which depends on perceptual capacity and perceptual load. So the circle overall is showing that I have a certain amount of perceptual capacity when I am doing a task and when other things are coming up around me. And what A is showing is when my task is quite simple, that there's very little perceptual load being utilized for that task. And so I have this remaining perceptual capacity, which means that I'm more easily distracted, as distractions can come into that open area there. Whereas when my perceptual load becomes very complicated and I have to pay much more attention to that primary task, it's going to take up all of my perceptual capacity, and now there's less effect of these distractions while we are performing our task. As an example, I usually use the example of my nephew, who plays a lot of video games, and when he's playing a video game, as he says, like World of Warcraft, where all he has to do is go press some buttons over and over and go and do a certain thing over and over and over again, that it doesn't take a lot of perceptual capacity. And so he usually listens to podcasts, to history podcasts at the same time. Whereas when he's playing a game like Dark Souls, which takes a lot of his attention and he can't really think about anything else, he doesn't turn on anything because he doesn't hear it, basically. There's no reason to turn on a podcast because he's not hearing any of that podcast. So continuing to look at this question of potential distractions while we are performing a task, one of the big questions has become what's happening as we are driving and we are having more and more potential distractions. In this study by Dingus et al. In 2006, the 100-car naturalistic driving study, they recorded, so participants allowed them to put video cameras on their windshields and their dashboards so that they could see what was going on. They recorded 2 million miles of driving, and this included 82 crashes and 771 near crashes. And just so we're made aware of kind of how these distractions can influence us, 80% of the crashes and 67% of the near crashes, the driver was inattentive in some way 3 seconds right before that crash or near crash happened. And obviously it's higher when there was an actual crash. And I know he gives us the example of someone reaching over to eat a sandwich, but just as so we are, again, kind of remaining aware, 22% of the time the driver that was being recorded was pushing buttons on a cell phone or some similar device. So I think it's really important for all of us to remind ourselves that when we are in a car, driving is our task. And it's really important that we are aware of the fact that we can hurt people, that we can run into other cars, that we can run into pedestrians, and this kind of stuff sometimes happens very quickly. And if we're not paying attention, like a lot of what we're doing during driving is very automatic. So it feels like you kind of want to do something else, but at the same time, when we need that attention, our attention needs to be fully focused. And if we've already missed what's happening with all of that, inattention blindness and change blindness and all of that, then we've missed it, and we're already endangering ourselves and other people. So one of the labs that have looked at this a great deal is David Strayer's lab and a bunch of his colleagues, where in 2001, Strayer and Johnson found those results that are on the right there, that they were looking at people who were driving in a simulated situation and how many red lights did they miss and what was their reaction time with that red light. And what they were doing was they were either on a cell phone talking to someone in the laboratory who was just asking them questions about their day versus not on a cell phone at all. And clearly they missed fewer lights and their reaction time was quicker when they were not on a cell phone than when they were. If I remember correctly, they also did this with a kind of hands-free cell phone to show that this was really, as Strayer et al. In 2013 say, this is about the mental resources that are being used, that talking on the phone uses mental resources that would otherwise be used for driving the car. I have often had people, especially my older adults, ask me, well, every time you're in the car with your children or with your friends or any time else, you have people who are potentially distracting you. And yes, people with children in their car, that's also somewhat dangerous to some extent if their children are not aware that driving the car is important. But most of the time, when we were with our friends in a car, they are also aware of whatever situation that we are getting into. If there is construction on the road or something with red lights or something that's changing, and they, if anything, are helping us to navigate as opposed to just talking to us and being distracting to us because they don't know what we are dealing with in our current situation. Something he has taken out of the book, but I think most students are actually hoping that we get to talk about some of this non-normative experience and as filtered through perception, because again, everything's filtered through perception. So if we're perceiving the world differently, then we are experiencing the world differently. And some of this is from an old edition of Goldstein, and a little bit of this is from my past work with Landmark College's Institute for Research and Training. Again, Landmark College, I think I mentioned this before when we talked about language disabilities, that Landmark College is a college that allows people who learn differently to get their associate's degree, and at the same time that they're earning this associate's degree, they are training them to really advocate for themselves and to make sure that they're getting their accommodations and everything that they need. But so some of this is from them as well. But I'm going to talk a little bit about attention and autism. So attention is really important for social situations, as I'm sure most of you are somewhat aware, but let's think about this on a more specific kind of scale of what we're doing. In a social situation, we are paying attention to what other people are saying. Hopefully, we're doing well at that. We pay attention to other people's faces. We get emotional information as well as we watch their mouths to better understand what they're saying, especially if you're like me and you don't hear very well and there's any kind of background noise. I'll start looking at your mouth to see what you're saying. We also pay attention to where other people are looking, because there's this kind of joint attention that what I'm talking about, I'm typically, a lot of the times, if we're doing something together, I'm looking at what we're referring to, and you're looking at my eyes to get that information. Before we really talk about attention and autism, I'm going to talk about some of the characteristics of people who have ASD, or autism spectrum disorder, or they're on that spectrum. And they have a different neurology. They have different abilities and disabilities in their physiological processing of what's some of the areas of their regions of their brain. First of all, they have slow or impaired facial processing. They also have slower or impaired ability to perceive and process faint facial and body movements. So a lot of our emotional information that we are giving off to other people when we are talking or doing something is coming through our face and through these body movements or our body language that we might not even be very aware of ourselves as we were giving them off. But if we're very excited, people can tell, and if we're really closed off, people can tell. So they're not very perceptive to the the overall emotional context. They have impairments to those structures. So the superior temporal sulcus is damaged. Some of the cerebellum and its communication to other areas is damaged. So some of that timing is damaged. So that they have a harder time reading facial expressions, harder time processing intonation of speech. Again, those structures and the kind of right hemisphere that are allowing us to, if I get angry at you, you can hear it. If I'm happy with you, you can hear it in the intonation of my speech. They're missing some of that. They also have, and I think this is important to always leave in there, this impaired proprioceptive or vestibular processing. So when I was in library science, when I was getting that degree, I did some research on people who are of differing abilities, or I did the ADA kind of legislation of the American Disabilities Act, but really because of my own issues, I really think of it as people with differing abilities, that they suggested that if you want to kind of imagine yourself somewhat more closer to being autistic, you might want to sit on one of those yoga balls, those like big balls that they exercise with, and try to do your work while trying to balance yourself on that ball, because the proprioceptive and vestibular processing that they are doing, there's so much concentration on that of course, I mean, that is the cerebellum, so of course they're going to have some impairments to some of these other structures, because their attention is not on necessarily their social world and the faint facial and body movements. Their attention is on keeping their balance and maintaining their proprioception kind of abilities. So autism is a serious developmental disorder marked by major withdrawal from people. They typically do not make eye contact, and they have difficulty gauging emotions. But if you notice some of this, most people talk about people with autism as if they aren't interested in social situations because of these, what we see in this kind of withdrawal and not making eye contact and the difficulty gauging emotions. But I honestly feel like a lot of the times they are just so overwhelmed that being in a social situation is even more overwhelming. I have spent some time shadowing autistic children when my sister was shadowing an autistic boy, And I went down a couple days and followed her, the teacher that she was really with. And I've had 2 autistic children as I was in the library science kind of world, as I was doing my outreach in my library, in my rural library, and I really felt like they were talking about things like the sounds of the lights, and I just felt like they were that they really actually wanted to be socially involved with other people, but that it was with all the impairments and what they needed to pay attention to, they were so overwhelmed, and especially in social situations, that maybe it was just sometimes too much for them. It's not that they're purposefully withdrawing or that they don't want that contact. So this is from the old Goldstein edition, where we are looking at what viewers are looking at, where their eye movements are in this scene with George Siegel and Sandy Duncan. And I'm going to go ahead and explain just a little bit of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, this movie. It's kind of a harsh movie to watch. It's an older movie where Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton are playing this couple. And if you know them, they were actually in real life married and divorced maybe 5 times. And so they're playing this couple where Richard Burton is the well-known, the prominent person at the university, and George Siegel, the guy in this picture, is new to the university. And if you know kind of the status of university people, when you're new, you're just really trying to impress everybody. Everything's really uncomfortable. You know, you need to worry about publishing and tenure and everything. And so they invite George Siegel over, and he brings his wife, Sandy Duncan, the actors and actresses in this movie. And if we look at, so what's happening in this scene is, let me see. I can't remember if she just threw something at him or she just slapped him. So Elizabeth Taylor, let's just say, just slapped Richard Burton across the face or just threw something at him. And of course, what a typically developing viewer is going to do is they're going to look at George Siegel's face. So we go over to George Siegel's face and look at him. He looks shocked, which is a normal reaction to that kind of just dismaying performance of somebody having that emotional scene in front of you. Most of us are going to look in his eyes because that's where we get the most information about emotion. But if we look at the viewers with autism, where are they looking? They're looking at mostly around sort of the middle of them or the right shoulder of Sandy Duncan. If they are looking at Sandy Duncan, they're looking at, most commonly, I think this is interesting, and this is something that is typical of them, they're looking to the sort of right side of her cheek, which is something that autistic people tend to do. And they've chosen Sandy Duncan, who throughout this whole movie, she is giving this kind of mask of trying not to show any emotion. And so here's another scene from the movie where they're showing the eye movements of typically developing viewers. They're in white, and viewers with autism, they're in black. And in this scene, George Siegel is asking Richard Burton, I'm just giving the actors' names because it's been so long since I've watched this movie. It's really, really hard to watch. He's asking him about the particular painting on the wall, and he's pointing at it. So what we normally do is we look at the shoulder front with the arm that he's pointing with, and then we follow his finger to figure out this is the picture he's pointing at. And then I actually think Richard Burton says something, and so they're looking at the painting itself, and then they look at Richard Burton's eyes, and they go back to George Siegel's eyes. That's kind of the typical thing to do. Whereas if you look at the people with autism, okay, they start at the right shoulder, which is uninformative in this case because he's pointing with his left hand. And then they're off in a different place. And then they're off at another different place. And then they're going back and forth trying to figure out basically what painting is he asking about in this social situation. Okay, and so clearly autistic people are attending differently. I'm going to ask here what this might mean with regard to their perception and their experience of the world. I know I've talked a bit more than I actually usually do about all of that. And I think this is, so there's a teeny tiny bit that I usually do with the brain on attention that we can finish up on Monday. And maybe I'll start with this slide and see if people have some responses of how you guys feel about how people on the autism spectrum are experiencing their world.